So does anybody know who this is? So this is Bruno Madrigal. And where does this come from? So what movie is this from? Encanto. Very good. And what's so special about Bruno? We don't talk about Bruno. Okay. And I like that. We don't talk about Bruno, right? Yes, it is a movie. It's Encanto, and it is. I'm getting a couple comments in chat here, and we don't talk about Bruno. So many of you are probably familiar with this, even if you haven't seen the movie Encanto. If you've looked at any social media and or heard the song, which actually plays on the radio, we don't talk about Bruno. Considering that the Madrigal family has an entire musical number devoted to Bruno, what do you think they think about Bruno? So do you think that they have strong feelings about Bruno? What do you guys think? Okay, I got a comment. We aren't supposed to talk about him, but singing is acceptable, apparently. Yes. Yes, indeed. So what is it about Bruno and the relationship that we see here? Do you guys think that there are strong feelings about Bruno? What do you guys think? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. What do you think those feelings are? Do you think that, like, what do you think the relationship is with Bruno? For those of you who have seen the movie, you're going to be able to answer this a little bit better. Okay. They're upset with him. Okay. Resentment. Okay. Would you agree that the family members have a particular attitude about Bruno? So would you agree with that? Yeah, I would say that they definitely feel they don't have the best relationship with him, that they have very strong feelings about Bruno. And when we talk about specifically about attitudes, right, we can have a positive or a negative attitude toward a person, toward someone, toward something. And so in this case, Bruno is a fantastic example of a particular negative attitude, very strong feelings towards a particular person, or in this case, a character. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some major concepts that when you walk away from this class that you should be able to know a lot about, right? And so one, you're going to be able to define what attitudes are. You're going to be able to understand the components of attitudes. You're going to be able to describe how they're formed. You can use psychological concepts to understand how to change a person's attitude, and also how to prevent your attitude from changing as well. And so one way that we can change attitudes is through the use of persuasion. And so part of what we're going to talk about today is how to sort of inoculate yourself from that persuasion so that you are not easily swayed. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into the nature and the origins of attitudes to explore them further. And like I said before, a lot of this information are on the slides that you currently have. I'm just kind of presenting it a little bit visually in a different way. So one thing to keep in mind is that people are not passively navigating their environment. Okay. We like to refer to people as sort of amateur psychologists or amateur social psychologists because they evaluate everything that they encounter. And these evaluations that we talk about are what we refer to as attitudes. So an attitude is an evaluation of a people, of a person, of people, of objects, of ideas. And so when we ask ourselves, okay, what are attitudes? These are these evaluations. How do we form them? Where do they come from? Well, it turns out that there are a couple of really important areas that we know are responsible for where attitudes kind of come from. One of those is that attitudes can have a sort of genetic component to it. So we know from twin studies that identical twins, they share a lot more common attitudes compared to fraternal twins, so non-identical twins and siblings. What plays into this are things like temperament and personality, because they kind of form the basis on what we're going to attend to and how we're going to form particular attitudes. So because temperament and personality have a genetic basis, that tells us that this kind of precursor to being able to evaluate information and in the frame in that which we do so is genetically impacted by genetics. We know that, of course, attitudes are also a result of that as well. So so this is kind of like the whole nature versus nurture debate, right? So if we go nature, we're talking about genetics. If we go nurture, we're talking about our environment. In this case, we're talking about social experiences. And so we know that social experiences play a really important role in forming our attitudes, because who we are exposed to, especially at an early age, is going to impact about how we feel about things, right? So for example, if you have a young child who is in a situation where maybe they're on a playground, and maybe the child that's on the playground is white, has a white family, and sees a child of a different color, and the parent says to the child, "Oh, we don't play with them because they're different from us." That is a social experience. It's going to shape that child's attitude about others, and in this case, of a different color. And we can look at the same thing across the board, different kinds of people, different kinds of things. We can even have the same attitude towards dogs, right? So maybe your mom is terrified of dogs and takes you to a park and sees a dog and acts very fearful and says, "We don't play with dogs, they're really dangerous," and has a very specific attitude towards dogs. Well, that child will then adopt that attitude. Now, just because you adopt a certain attitude, even at an early age, doesn't mean you're destined to have that attitude for all of eternity, right? So we know that attitudes can change over time, but what you are rooted in early on tends to come from those experiences of your parents, of other kids, of other family members. Another interesting thing about attitudes is that not all attitudes are created equally, as you can imagine, right? So think about your feelings towards religion, okay? So compare your feelings towards religion, and then maybe how you feel about wearing a particular brand of socks. For a lot of people, they don't hold these attitudes equally, right? Unless you're extremely passionate about socks, or not very passionate about religion, these attitudes that you have usually are weighted differently, right? And so they can be more heavily rooted in one particular component than the next. And so one really important thing is understanding these components and how they play into each other to form attitudes. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So this is the really important part about attitudes that I want you guys to really know about and learn about. So there's three major components of attitudes. We call them the ABCs of attitudes, right? So first is the affective component. And this is what's rooted in emotion and feelings. It's not rooted in facts or thoughts. This is kind of how you feel about a particular thing. They come from things like, they come from values, right? They come from religious, moral beliefs. They come from sensory reactions, like how you like the taste of ice cream. They come from aesthetic reactions, like admiring the lines of a car. They also come from things like classical and operant conditioning. So if you've taken learning, even remembering from Intro to Psych, where we talk about conditioning. So remember, classical conditioning is where an involuntary response is learned through association. So an example of this is you smell a particular perfume. Maybe your grandmother wears that perfume all the time. And then every time you smell the perfume, you associate that perfume with your grandmother. And you associate very happy feelings with her because you love your grandmother very much and you were very close to her. So every time you smell that perfume, you have now now linked these kind of fuzzy, warm feelings to that scent. So every time you smell that perfume, you're going to have a positive and emotional attitude towards that smell. It's going to kind of bring in that involuntary response of happy, warm, fuzzy feelings. That is because you have actually learned to associate this smell with the feelings that you have towards your grandmother. So of course you can have, positive reactions to things. You can have fearful reactions to things, happy reactions, whatever that, kind of, involuntary response. Same thing with hunger and things like that, all involuntary responses. So that is an affectively based attitude, one that's rooted in emotion, it's rooted in feeling. The second type of component is behavioral. So behavioral components, these are rooted in observable behaviors. So instead of looking at cognitions and emotions, we're looking at behavior. So an example of this would be, let's say you have a friend who runs all the time, right? They do like marathons, and they go out and run, 4 times a week. And you say to that person, wow, you must really love running because, man, you just do it all the time. And if that behavior is rooted in, if that attitude about running is rooted in a behavioral component, that person might actually say, oh, well, wow, I guess I do it all the time. Okay, yeah, I guess I like it. And it's not that it's really rooted in emotion. They don't like love it with all their life. It's just, it's a behavioral thing that they do all the time, and it's rooted in their actions. I'll give you another example. So my husband is an avid coffee drinker, okay, but he's not really like attached to a particular kind of coffee, or just like he doesn't have coffee related paraphernalia around the house, right? He doesn't have like an I love coffee magnet. He just religiously drinks it every morning. And so because he doesn't particularly tie it to a taste, he'll kind of drink anything. But he does like his like Starbies, right? He does like to get his Starbies every now and then. But generally speaking, when it comes to coffee, he's just like, nah, I drink it all the time. I just drink it just to, as a pick me up. I drink it. Just that's what I do. And that is a behaviorally based component, behaviorally based attitude with a component rooted in behavioral, right? So the final component that we're going to talk about is the cognitive component. So these are things that are rooted in the properties of an attitude, right? So these are attitudes that you have that are based in fact and based in thoughts. And so these are the ones that we are going to kind of talk about next. So the first prompt is, what kinds of factors do you consider when buying a car? Okay, so let's take a look at this. I'm going to read off a couple of these answers. Gas mileage, safety, how reliable it is, and price of the vehicle, gas mileage, make and model, mileage, condition, how easy it is to work on, price, gas mileage, amenities like heated seats, sunroof, maintenance costs, safety features, gas, mileage. I'm kind of noting a pattern in the mileage, and it wouldn't be because gas is insanely expensive right now, is it? Or is that just a coincidence, right? Affordability, safety, reliability, how old it is. Couple of comments about do they personally like the look of the car? Okay, what kind of features are available? A lot of things about how much does it cost? Is it reliable? So a lot of very similar answers here. Kelley Blue Book value, the Carfax, has it been in accidents? What's the mileage on the car? Versatility, durability, all super fantastic answers. Now, let me ask you this. A lot of people wrote the same sort of things, right? So you said things like price, safety, gas mileage, condition, right? What do you think, if those were your top things, right? How expensive is it? Is it safe? Does it get good gas mileage? If those are your top number 3 reasons and factors in considering purchasing a car, what do you think your attitude is rooted in when it comes to attitudes about purchasing a vehicle or cars? So what component, remember there's the ABCs of components, affective, behavioral, and cognitive components. What is your attitude rooted in? What component? If your top 3 factors are affordability, safety, and gas mileage. Cognitive, exactly. Cognitive, right. So a lot of you are answering that. That's exactly right. So I would assume that if your main attitude about purchasing a car is all about mileage, fuel efficiency, price, safety, these are things that you can look up and get factual information on and be able to say, this particular car, it costs this much. This is the, rating in terms of safety. It ranks this, for these kinds of cars. These are things that you can actually find in a book online, those types of things. And so you might even find that you would rather buy a super ugly car, but as long as it had good gas mileage and was affordable and safe, then you're okay with that. So you would choose a less appealing car that maybe doesn't have as many of the amenities, because you are what's more important to you are those facts, right? Now, let's say that you wanted, your number one thing is, what does that car look like? Does it look good? Is it a good color? Does it look new? What do you think your attitude is rooted in? If you are first looking at the look of the car over price, mileage, safety, what component is your attitude rooted in? If you're interested in the aesthetics of the vehicle, it's an affectively based component, right? Exactly. It's affectively based. If you are the type of person that says, well, I only buy Fords. That's just what I do. I only buy Fords. I've only ever had Fords. I'm only going to buy a Ford. And if it's not a Ford, I'm not going to buy it. What attitude component is that attitude rooted in? Remember, there's only 3, A, B, C: affective, behavioral, or cognitive. It's behavioral because it's based on the behavior. Your actions speak very loudly. Okay. You're always looking to do the same behavior over and over and over again. Okay. You don't have a particular tie to how pretty it is or anything like that. It's just what you do. Okay. That's what you do. It's behaviorally based. Now, there are, your attitudes aren't just rooted in one component. Of course, these are the types of things that get rooted in multiple components. It's just, which one does it kind of lean more toward? So you can decide to purchase a car because the gas mileage is great, it's in good condition, it's safe, but also it looks nice. And you choose the car because first it's got these cognitive, factors, these facts. And then also it can have an affective component where your emotion comes in and you determine you like the look of the car. So your attitudes can be rooted in multiple components. The point that I'm trying to make is that most attitudes are rooted in one component over another in terms of majority. Okay. So if you're purchasing a car and you're interested in the facts, how safe is it? How reliable is it? What's the mileage? What's the gas mileage? That's a cognitively based attitude. If you're interested in just the look and feel of the car, you don't care how much it costs, but it's just pretty and you love it, that's affectively based component because it's based in sensory reaction. If you just buy Fords because you just buy Fords and that's what you do, okay, that's the behaviorally based component because that attitude, because that is rooted in behavior. Let's talk about implicit and explicit attitudes. Okay. So explicit attitudes, and we've talked a little bit about this already in some of the other kinds of lectures that we've done, but I'm going to go back over this. So explicit attitudes are sort of external attitudes. Okay. These are ones that you're actively aware of. You can verbalize how you feel. You can talk about it. So for example, you might know exactly where you stand on your favorite type of movie. You can tell me like you like Marvel more than DC because of the storylines and character development, or maybe you like DC better, but I doubt it because nobody likes DC better. But it's just one of those things where you can talk about it. And this doesn't matter what the attitude is rooted in terms of components, A, B, or C, doesn't matter. What matters is an external attitude that you can physically talk about. You feel pretty good about it. You can verbalize it and you can discuss it. Implicit or sort of internal attitudes, these are ones that are involuntary, they're uncontrollable. A lot of times you're not even aware of how you feel about a particular thing. And we a lot of times talk about implicit attitudes when it comes to groups of people. But remember, implicit attitudes can be about anything, right? And again, it doesn't matter what it's rooted in, the ABCs. What matters is that it's an internal attitude that you can't really talk about. It's sort of unconscious, or subconscious is a better word. And so we can talk about how you feel about particular religions, ethnicities, but remember, they can be about anything. You can actually have a bias toward someone or something, right? Or against. So let's say you have a lot of police officers in your family, and you really, feel very strongly about the law enforcement, about law enforcement officers, and you don't even realize that you have an internal implicit bias towards law enforcement officers. And so you could not even realize that you act a certain way towards them, that you feel a particular way towards them that you can't really verbalize. But because your family is made up of a lot of law enforcement officers, you feel this particular bias towards them. Same thing with like military members. Let's say you grew up in a military family, you might have a bias toward military or service members because that's just what you have kind of been brought up with, but you didn't even realize that you had this particular attitude. Now, it's always a good idea to learn where you stand when it comes to implicit attitudes, because when we know about how we feel about groups of people, we can become more aware or cognizant of our actions towards others. We might not even realize that we have a particular bias towards a particular person or group, and that biased behaviors come from that and can actually harm others. Becoming aware of our attitudes means that you become a better, more empathetic and caring person. And so when we are more aware, we can work towards creating a more equitable, inclusive world. We can equalize the playing field. And so we want other people to have the same opportunities that everyone else has. And I've got a question here. Where do they come from? Can they be picked up subconsciously, especially during childhood while watching our parents? Absolutely. A lot of our implicit attitudes are really rooted in our particular social experiences. And yes, the example, how parents behave towards a particular race. Yes, that's a good example of how a person might develop these attitudes. So maybe you have family members that are very vocal about to particular races or ethnicities, and you just kind of adopted the attitude without even realizing it. So some people do things that they're not even aware of. So for example, this is where we get microaggressions. This is where we get particular behaviors that we don't even realize that we do. So an example would be, let's say you're white and you're walking down the street and you see a person of color coming toward you and you cross the street. And it's not like you're cognizant of it. You're not even aware that you crossed the street to avoid that person, but you did that because that's kind of internal and unconscious or subconscious. Same thing with, like, for example, working with people who have particular disabilities. Maybe you have a particular bias against people and didn't even realize it. And, you act in a certain way that isn't very inclusive just because you've never really kind of had to think about that thing. And so, those behaviors are kind of rooted in experience sometimes. And because they're unconscious, subconscious, they're really, really hard to measure. And so we don't have a super fantastic way for us to know what our implicit attitudes are. So what they've done, what social psychologists have done, have come up with different tools to try to learn how we know about particular attitudes. So this QR code right here, this is for the Harvard Implicit Attitudes Test, or the IAT. And that will give you this website right here. And that is what's going to give you a bunch of different kinds of versions of the implicit attitudes test. So you can take it on certain ethnicities, you can take it on certain kinds of people, just to kind of see where you fall. And you might be surprised about where your attitudes fall when it comes to looking at different kinds of people. And so it's always a good idea to kind of check yourself and see where you fall in that. Now, the last thing that I want to kind of talk about, and I'm only going to talk about it really briefly, and we'll pick up next class where we have a full class to talk about this. We're going to talk a little bit about culture and how these different kinds of attitudes are rooted. And one really important takeaway that I want you to take away from today, and then we'll take into next class, is about how the way that we form attitudes and the fact that there are different components of attitudes, this is universal. Everybody does this. Okay. What's different in terms of culture is what those attitudes, like what they're about. What is kind of the focus in terms of what certain cultures feel more strongly about, and where it goes in terms of, is it rooted more in the social group or is it rooted more in individual kind of components, the individual. So think of it like the collectivist versus individualistic cultures. And we're going to get into detail into that next class.